Chapter 55, A New Kind of Power. Martin Luther King Jr. was carried to his grave in a casket of polished African mahogany on a plain farm cart pulled by two mules. The cart and the mules reminded people that King's ancestors had farmed America's land with courage and dignity. The mahogany symbolized his African heritage. Weeping at the graveside were leaders from around the world who had come to pay tribute to the man who had earned a Nobel Peace Prize with his message of love and brotherhood and peace. But at the very time King was being lowered into the ground, 130 cities around the nation were burning. Rioters, looting and shooting, were killing people and destroying homes and businesses. 65,000 troops had to be called in to put down the riots. Almost all the victims were black. When the fires cooled, 39 people were dead. The rioters said they were responding to the murder of Martin Luther King Jr. But was that the right thing to do in memory of a man who had dedicated his life to nonviolence? Hadn't they heard his message? Most black people had. Every poll showed that the majority of African Americans approved of the ideas of Martin Luther King Jr. and disapproved of violence. But a black minority, a strong, active minority, was listening to other voices. Mostly those voices were young, male, urban, and angry. They were black power leaders. They wanted to change their world, and it certainly needed changing. Some of them seemed to want power so they could get even for the terrible oppression of slavery and segregation. Some, disgusted by all the oppression, wanted to separate themselves from whites. But some others wanted to bring respect and power to a black community that could then act on equal terms with whites. A year of headlines, 1968. Pause your video for a moment and read through the timeline. That first idea didn't go far. Most black people had no intention of being oppressors. A few did want to separate themselves from the rest of America's citizens, which, after the sacrifices of the civil rights time, was difficult for many to understand. But that idea of power through respect, now that was appealing. Soon, blacks and whites too were studying African American history. They were also learning about Africa and its history. They were wearing African-inspired clothes. They were telling stories of slavery from the slave's point of view. They were taking pride in an inheritance full of stories of achievement. They were voting and electing blacks as sheriffs and mayors and congresspeople. Black writers were bringing new sensitivities to readers. They were not just writing for African Americans, they were writing for all people. In 1940, Richard Wright published Native Son. 5 years later, his Black Boy was a main selection of the Book of the Month Club. Ralph Ellison, whose ancestry was black, white, and Native American, wrote Invisible Man in 1952, a novel about the ways in which society can ignore the ordinary person and make him feel invisible and powerless. In a stunning first novel titled Go Tell It on the Mountain, 1953, James Baldwin wrote about the religious awakening of a boy living in Harlem. Black women were among the best writers of the time. Zora Neale Hurston, who was part of the pre-World War II artistic movement known as the Harlem Renaissance, was rediscovered and celebrated. Hurston's great novel, Their Eyes Were Watching God, which is both funny and profound, inspired many other writers. Toni Morrison was one of them. She won the Nobel Prize for Literature. There is no higher honor. Alice Walker, Maya Angelou, and Polly Marshall, too, found power in words and ideas. Before he was killed, Malcolm X found power as a speechmaker. Malcolm had quit school, become a thief and a drug peddler, and landed in jail. He was frustrated. He wanted to turn his life around, but he couldn't express himself because he didn't have control of the English language. He decided to do something about that. He got a dictionary from the prison school and carefully copied every word onto a tablet. With every succeeding page, he recalled, I also learned of people and places and events from history. As his vocabulary grew, so did his sense of power and confidence. In 1960, blacks had very little political power. In that year, there were only a few more than 100 black elected officials in the whole United States. By 1993, there were more than 8,000, including 40 members of Congress. Thurgood Marshall and Clarence Thomas had been appointed justices of the Supreme Court. Between 1950 and 1990, the number of African Americans in white-collar jobs, which means those who work in offices, leapt from 10% to 40% of all black workers. Black men and women were engineers, doctors, lawyers, politicians, ball players, government workers, and artists. Many lived in beautiful houses and belonged to fancy clubs. As to entertainment and sports, Bill Cosby and Irvin Magic Johnson were hard to top until Oprah Winfrey, Michael Jordan, and Tiger Woods came along. Although most people still seem to think in racial terms, that concern was hiding the real problem, poverty in this prosperous land. Martin Luther King Jr. had seen that. Bobby Kennedy understood that America would never truly be a land of the free if some people were trapped in poverty and inequality. Today in America, he said, we are two worlds. We are the worlds of the rich and the poor. He said he hoped to build a bridge between those worlds. Kennedy decided he would run for president. There were many who believed he would win. And so he set out giving speeches across the country. Young people flocked to his side. Wherever he went, however, along with the cheers, there were also hate pamphlets. In California, 2 months after Dr. King's funeral, Kennedy won the Democratic primaries in California and South Dakota. On June 5, 1968, in front of a cheering crowd, he thanked some of those who helped him, his staff, his friends, his wife, and Cesar Chavez. Then, Robert Kennedy, heading for a press conference, took a shortcut through the hotel kitchen. A shot rang out, and the man who might have been president was no more. It was the end of an era. Each time a man stands up for an ideal, or acts to improve the lot of others, or strikes out against justice, he sends a tiny ripple of hope, and crossing each other from a million different centers of energy and daring, these ripples will build a current which can sweep down the mightiest of walls of oppression and resistance. Robert Kennedy, speaking in South Africa.